Welcome to the Club Eisenhower podcast. I'm your host, Todd Arrington, and it's my pleasure to be the director of the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum here in beautiful Abilene, Kansas. Thanks for listening to us today as we look at the history of Native American code talkers in World War II. I'm very pleased to introduce our distinguished guest, Dr. William Meadows of Missouri State University. Dr. Meadows, Bill, thanks so much for being here today. Before we jump into the topic at hand, I wonder if maybe you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your work and kind of how you came to be interested in writing about Native American code talkers.
Okay, thank you for inviting me and having me on the program. I appreciate that. I went to grad school at University of Oklahoma, and I was working on my dissertation, which had to do with Native American veterans organizations, and particularly their ceremonies that they still have today. And I was interviewing a gentleman who was a leader in one of those, who happened to be a Comanche man. And while we were doing an interview, I asked him what was his MOS, his job title in the war. And he told me, he kind of chuckled and he said, well, technically I'm this number, a slow speed radio operator, but he said me and 16 other guys were recruited about a year before Pearl Harbor, and almost a year before Pearl Harbor, and trained and then given a task of creating a code in the Comanche language to send communications that could not be broken or compromised. And he said, well, there's 3-4 other men still alive that were in the unit with me. Our training officer's still alive. I could put you in touch with those. And he said, why don't you write an article on this, right now? And I said, well, Forrest, I'm kind of in the middle of my dissertation, And he said, oh, that can, you can put that on the shelf for a while. That can wait, and
famous last words there.
Yeah, he may not realize what all a dissertation involved, but he was right. I went back to the library. I started researching, and about the same time that I was doing this work with him and others, my grandfather passed, he was a World War II veteran. And it dawned on me, these guys are already in their 70s. They're in that same cohort. They're not going to be here forever. And there was only like 4 or 5 of them left. So I just decided right in the middle of my dissertation, I'm going to take on this other project and do it because the time demands it, And so I did. I started, I contacted the other members, started doing interviews with them. And then I went back to see him one day and I said, oh, well, I've got something to tell you about that article you want. And he said, well, what is it? I said, well, I have good news and bad news. He goes, what's the bad news? I said, well, I'm not going to be able to do that article you wanted, And he kind of took a big, deep, sigh and everything. And he said, well, what's the good news? I said, well, it's going to be a book instead of an article, And he said, you tricked me. And I said, I certainly did, And he was a great guy, real great sense of humor and everything. But that man's name was Forrest Casanavoid, and he was Comanche. And just by going to see him that day about something else is what led me on to this other path. And so this became my second major project. And from there, it just branched out, and I've worked all across the country, work on other things still, but I still work on the code talkers as well with the groups all across the country.
And correct me if I'm wrong, you're an anthropologist rather than a historian, right?
I have degrees in both, but
okay.
Yeah, I have more anthropology than history, but I blend the two together very well, ethnohistory. But yeah, my doctorate and master's are actually in anthropology. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for telling us a little bit about yourself. And now we'll kind of jump into it a little bit more in depth here. I wonder if maybe it would be helpful to sort of define what we mean when we say code talker. Can you kind of give us is there a good sort of working definition of that so that people understand what we're talking about here exactly?
Sure. I don't know there's a textbook definition, but it's essentially Native Americans in the First and Second World War that used their languages specifically to send military intelligence messages and everything. And the reason being is so that it would not be known by the enemy, and therefore as unknown languages and also as coded languages, it wouldn't be able to be broken and everything. but that's generally what we're talking about. Not individuals who just happen to speak a language and are visiting with each other, but the ones who are actually serving as radio men to send military messages in conflict.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. So before we kind of jump into the World War II side of this, I did read some of your work sort of in preparation for this conversation. And I, for one, was very surprised to learn that there actually were code talkers in World War I. And I know you alluded to this earlier. So how did the code talkers come about in World War I? And then we can kind of sort of move forward into the World War II history. But I think a little background there would be helpful for folks that are listening.
Sure. There's at least 7 groups that I've identified in World War I so far. I suspect there were probably some others. The reason that so little is known about World War I is that it was a impromptu experiment that was developed in the field in combat. It wasn't something that existed in the training manuals or the Army programming or training or anything of that nature. And we have several cases that we know independently. There doesn't seem to have been any central plan either. The situation groups were facing was the Germans are great linguists in World War I, very intelligent, knew most of the world's major languages and everything. They were breaking our communications regularly, and they had several ways they could do it. They could clip into our lines and simply listen. They had a magnetic listening device that could draw the signal and listen in. They were capturing or taking out 1 out of every 4 of our runners who were physically carrying messages. So the idea, different officers realized that every time they tried to do something, the Germans were a step ahead. And there's a couple situations, one in which an officer is speaking with another officer down the line. And one says, "How is it with you today?" And he said, "Well, it's fine. The Germans have been showing us all day, but they're hitting 100 yards behind us. They're not scratching us or doing anything." Mm-hmm. And within just a couple moments, those shells started coming in right in on his position. And so it dawned on him, they're listening to everything we're saying. So they sent out a fake message on another day to move a couple companies of men, some artillery, some supporting units to a particular hill. And they sent the message just like they normally would in everyday English, and tested it, the date, the time. And at precisely a minute or 2 after that time, that hill was just obliterated by German artillery. So they knew that was their test to see if they were right. So to solve this, different groups began to say, what can we do to get past this scenario, this situation? And in several of the groups that had a lot of Native Americans, different officers had the idea, well, we have these Indian boys who they sit around and talk to each other in their own languages all the time. What if we have them send the messages? And so they begin getting small units of them to do just that very thing. But it was as an experiment, really. It was an adaptation to an existing problem, and then move on and everything. But that's how code talking started in the First World War.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I was going to ask, were the U.S. Armed Forces specifically recruiting Native people to do this in World War I? And it sounds like that's not the case. It was just, as you say, kind of a circumstance where they tried it as an experiment.
They were recruiting natives, but not for their languages. They were recruiting them primarily because of, kind of stereotypical image about their fighting abilities, but also the larger goal at the time was to assimilate them into American society. And this was in the military and the government's view, a very positive or large step towards that is to get them exposed and in the service and everything. So that created large numbers of them in there. But originally, yeah, you're right. It was not for their languages.
And I really appreciate what you just said, too, because one of the things when I was reading some of your work that really kind of stood out to me was the irony that this almost couldn't have happened because of the boarding school experiment that was going on with American Indian children being kind of forced into these boarding schools and assimilated and not allowed to speak their own languages. So had that really succeeded, it's possible that the code talkers would never have been able to come to pass because the
Yeah.
languages would no longer have existed.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And depending on what kind of boarding school you went to and at what age, had a lot to do with whether you came out of the boarding school bilingual or monolingual in English. And I had the opportunity to, when I first started my work, to interview people born back in the 1890s even. And most of them, came through the boarding schools. If they were local boarding schools, they came through it and they still remembered their languages. But if they were sent to the far off ones, like out of state, at a very young age, those are the ones that tended to lose it. And then, of course, what they created was 2 or 3 generations that were made to feel bad about knowing those languages. And when you get to the World War II group, a lot of them still spoke their languages, but they were kind of ashamed of it in a sense of passing it on to their kids. And so a lot of that generation told me they just decided not to teach the kids because they needed to know English to, in the bigger society. So, but there were still plenty of people still speaking it in both wars,
Great. Yeah, that's really an interesting point too about the irony that it almost didn't happen. So,
yeah.
So thank goodness that experiment failed, I guess we could say.
Yes.
So when World War I ends, do the U.S. Armed Forces maintain any kind of code talker units, but in the era between the 2 world wars, or does this just all go away at the end of World War I and it has to kind of be rebuilt when we get into World War II?
Yeah, there's no attempt to necessarily preserve it or continue it. A lot of it was done also in the very last few months of the war, really towards the end of it. So there are some cases where we know groups only did this once or twice, or relatively few number of days and everything. It did produce important results on a local basis, just the units that were using it. But this is a really a drop in the bucket of all the troops involved. After the war, everybody just went home, was happy to have made it out of it. And so the Army remembered that they had it. And there were some documents. There was a project by a gentleman named Lieutenant John Eddy. He had been the superintendent at Crow Indian Reservation, and so had some experience with Native Americans. And he was gassed very late in the war. And so while he was recovering, they're looking for something that he could do that wasn't that physically taxing because of the gas. And so he developed a survey that he sent out to the officers in all the divisions, asking about how the natives in their units fared, how was their performance, different types of kind of a survey of the American Indian experience in World War I. And a lot of the information, what little we have, if it hadn't been for that survey, it would have never got written down. And so that survey actually preserved several accounts of it from different officers and things. And then in World War II, they're still aware of it. And then as early as 1939 and 40, the Army starts recruiting a few very small groups specifically to train and to actually develop codes. And this is something that had occurred in World War I, but didn't get fully used. The Choctaws used their language at a place called Forest Ferrum, and then they were sent back to a relief camp. They had a week, and then they were getting ready to head out for the campaign towards Metz and then Sedan. And during that week, they expanded their group size, and they were given orders to create code words for things that were difficult to say in Choctaw because the native language didn't have that kind of modern concept like a tank or like a grenade or poison gas, those kind of modern things. And so they did create code words, and they had them all ready to go. But the very day after their training finished of that week was the armistice. And so the idea to code languages was developed in World War I. The Choctaw is the only group that we actually have a surviving sample of vocabulary. So we don't know that it actually got implemented, but the languages did work. The ability to get messages across. And that's what was expanded upon in World War II, but with a few groups, very large, extensive formal codes.
Okay, so there were at least some Native people that were recruited specifically for this purpose for World War II then?
Yes, for World War II, yes.
Great.
The Army had, I believe, 5 groups, and then the Marine Corps, of course, with the Navajo.
Right. Okay. All right. Great. That's really interesting. And I was wondering if they had recruited people specifically for that purpose in World War II, or did they kind of do the same thing? I think you mentioned that they did in World War I, where they just took people who were in other military jobs and just sort of gave them this assignment. Okay, very interesting. So
let me elaborate on that just a moment.
Sure, of course.
So like I said, there was about 5 small groups in the Army that were recruited. And the Marine Corps had the biggest program, of course, with the Navajos, a very large group. In 43 and 44, there's a series of meetings. Now, this is before D-Day in Europe, of course. There's a series of meetings that I came across the papers of between the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. And of course, there is no independent Air Force at this time. It's right. Groups have their respective Air Corps. And they're debating the practicality of this. You know, should we use Native Americans? Is it safe? Is it trustworthy? Is it accurate? And it was pointed out that, well, groups did this in World War I, and it still was effective and everything. There was no issues of any kind of security or problem or honesty or anything like that. But there was a reticence to continue it because the military said, well, none of us can speak these languages, so we actually can't monitor the transmissions or know what they're really doing. We're just putting our faith in them being accurate enough and getting it done. So the Army decided not to expand the small code talking groups that it did. The Navy said, well, we tested some, it's okay, we just don't really need it for our purposes. And then the Marine Corps kept quiet in these meetings. They basically said, code talkers, what are you talking about? You know, so they were trying to keep their program very, very secretive. Now, what the Army did was, even though they didn't officially or formally recruit any more groups, individual officers took it upon their own initiative in different units. If they had multiple natives that spoke the same language, not all, but some of them just pulled men out and created their own little radio teams. And we have cases of 2 men sometimes in a team, 7 men in a team, 3, 4, etc. And so that's what I distinguish as a type 1 code talking and a type 2. Type 1 has the formal training and the coded vocabulary, and type 2 is just native speaking in their everyday vernacular language. So there was a lot of type 2 used in World War II. And I did get to meet some of those individuals and interview some, as well as track down some interviews and things like that. Both were effective. Both worked fine. None were broken. But there's actually actually more de facto code talkers in World War II than there are officially trained ones, you know.
I see. Okay. So, of course, we're the Eisenhower Presidential Library. So, as you might imagine, we're primarily interested here in the European theater of operations, because, of course, our namesake was the Supreme Allied Commander. Right. I think a lot of people, though, as you've already alluded to, when they hear the term code talker, they think maybe perhaps of the Navajo in the Pacific with the Marine Corps. Yeah. So we've established that there were code talkers in the European theater of operations. Can you tell us specifically what Native tribes or groups did a lot of these European theater code talkers hail from? You've mentioned a couple already. I'm just not sure if there's more or not.
There was 17 Comanches recruited and trained. 14 of them went to Europe, and 13 landed at Utah Beach. One stayed in England. He was really good at cryptology. 13 of them landed at Utah Beach and went in on D-Day in the next couple of days or so, and then on through France and Germany and the Bulge and all the way to the end of the war. There is a group of 8 Meskwakis from Tama, Iowa. most people don't recognize Meskwaki, but they'll recognize the name Sac and Fox. So the Meskwakis are the Fox part of the Sac and Fox. And they were in a division that went into North Africa and served at Kasserine Pass and all that, and across North Africa, and then later into Italy. And there are some Lakotas that are in an artillery battalion in Europe as well. There are, and this is a very limited what we know about this, there were some Navajos, because there were Navajos everywhere. There are some Navajo who were in Europe who were used as code talkers in the 45th Infantry Division. We do not know their names. We do not know how many, but Ernie Pyle noticed them while he was there working among the 45th. He heard them, he saw them, he knew what they were doing, and he made mention of them. So that's a de facto group, that they put together. They didn't go through the training like the ones in the Marine Corps did and everything.
Interesting.
I know of a couple, there's a couple Muskogee guys that met. Edmund Harjo was walking through an apple orchard in France just a few days after D-Day, and he heard another gentleman singing a song. And Edmund Harjo was Muskogee from Oklahoma. He not only recognized the song as his group, but he recognized the type of song that was being sung. So he made a beeline to that gentleman, and immediately they started talking in Muskogee. And a sergeant heard them and asked them what they were doing. And they said, "We're just visiting. We never met each other, but we're from the same group, speak the same language." And he took down their information, said, "I may be in touch." And they thought, in touch for what? Or like a private and a corporal, And a couple of days later, he got a paper transferring him to this unit. And he went there. He said, "Wait in that tent there, and somebody will be there with you shortly." When he opened the tent blind, the other guy was sitting in there. And so those two guys were pulled and made into a radio team for the rest of the war and everything. So there were many cases of that kind of use of them where, again, you could have somebody up front, pretty far up front, and somebody pretty far back, and have a very important secure line of communication.
Interesting. So it sounds like from what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like even in World War II, there were still some sort of on-the-fly, ad hoc, whatever you want to call it, opportunities to put people together who did speak the same native language.
Yes.
But then were there recruiting efforts going on to recruit specific tribal members, specific native people, because their languages were so unique and so difficult to crack?
Only those first few groups.
Gotcha.
There was a group of, let me think now a minute. There was a group of Chippewa and a group of Oneida, two different groups from Michigan and Wisconsin, who ended up in a division together. So they had two groups. The Comanches were from Oklahoma. The Meskwakis were from Iowa. And then later on, there was a small group of Hopi put together who the men were already in service, but they were later reassigned and culled together. But no, after those groups, and particularly after those meetings, they decided not to expand the program. So there was no formal recruiting, with the exception of the Marine Corps. And the Marine Corps, there are Navajos who were already in service, went through basic, etc., or as soon as they got out of basic, they were then reassigned to join a group to train as code talkers. So there was an ongoing recruitment, an active recruitment of them throughout the war, but not with the European groups. So they had the few that were trained and formally prepared, and then the rest were, like you say, they were de facto or ad hoc.
Gotcha. Okay, interesting.
It's still effective. So.
Oh, sure, absolutely, yeah. Is there any indication? I mean, have we seen any records or any anecdotes you've heard from veteran code talkers that you've spoken with? Is there any indication that the Germans in the European theater or the Japanese in the Pacific theater ever cracked any of these languages or came close to cracking them, or was this, I mean, basically 100% effective because of just how unique all of these languages are?
Yeah, there's a little bit to that. Let me first explain why the languages worked.
Sure.
The basic factors are, from a European perspective, these are unknown languages. So, even in America, unless you were like perhaps a trader in a trading post or married to a native, very few people spoke these languages that were not of these groups. So it made it an obscure language in that sense. The second point would be that most of these languages were not yet written in World War I and World War II. Now, some were, but the consumption of it was mostly for local consumption, things like Bibles or hymn books or things like that. It wasn't a booming body of literature that you could have went to a national library and, pulled things out on. So that Europeans didn't have access to that. Third, the syntax is it's not an Indo-European language, which the Germans would have, been able to do any of those. So the syntax, the grammar, all that is very, very different than European languages in a lot of cases. And so that would have made the degree of difficulty harder. And then lastly, by putting coded vocabulary into the language, it becomes like another layer. It becomes a code within an unknown language, kind of a double code, if you will. And so this made it very hard for them to even identify it. But we do know there are some German officers captured in World War I, and there is an exchange that was recorded, and of course there was courtesy shown among officers and things, even when POWs. And the German officer asked to ask a question, and they said certainly. And he said, we know all the major languages in the world. We have the finest linguists in the world. We've never heard anything like what you guys were speaking on the wire. What was it? And they just laughed and said, well, it was American, And of course, they're not going to tell them what it was. So they knew it was something different. But I'm sure after the war, because there was so much newspaper coverage that, they soon realized it was native. In World War II, the closest that it ever came to this situation was that the Japanese had identified by late 1944 that it was Navajo being used against them.
Oh, interesting.
And there were quite a few natives from New Mexico and Arizona in it's one of the New Mexico Coast Artillery units, and it was stationed in the Philippines, and a lot of natives in it. So when Bataan fell, when the Philippines fell to the Japanese and the Bataan Peninsula was encapsulated, a lot of those Indians were caught there in April of 42. Well, the very first Navajos recruited to leave on a bus did not go until like the last day of April in 1942. So the Navajo that were captured in the Philippines, they had no knowledge of any code talking group, a plan to use the language, anything. Well, there was a gentleman named Joe Kiyumi. His name, when you look at it, sounds Japanese, and there is a word that resembles it very closely in Japanese. He also has, a lot of the Navajos have Asiatic look to them. They look very similar to Japanese of many native groups. When they first captured him, they thought he was Japanese American, and so they were beating him, they were punishing him, they were calling him a traitor and things of that nature. And he said, no, I'm not Japanese. I'm an American Indian, And he finally yelled at them, I'm American Indian. I'm a Navajo, leave me alone. So they basically left him alone for a while. They sent him on a hell ship to Japan. He was working in slave labor camps and things. In the winter of 44, they came and pulled him into a room, and there was several people there. They had recordings, and they wanted him to listen to these recordings that they had made. And what it was the Navajo code talkers. And so he didn't know anything about the code being used or code talkers. And he said, well, that's my language, but it's not my language. It doesn't make sense, because he didn't know the code. and
Right.
they had reassigned all these Navajo terms to represent military things. And so it was gibberish to him, literally. It was like gibberish. And they didn't believe him. So they did some really intense things to him. And I won't go into all the details. He survived it, but he was tortured a bit. But he could not break it and everything. And he was as fluent a speaker as any of they were. He just simply was not a code talker. But I cannot prove it, but I've always suspected the way that they identified it is they had call signs, and some of the call signs that the Marines used, the code talkers, they would say New Mexico, New Mexico, or they would say Arizona, Arizona. And that told you wanted a code talker. In hindsight, that was a mistake. And I think what happened was the Japanese heard that. And so they're like, what is it about this language with New Mexico or Arizona? So you start process of elimination. It's not American whites. It's not Spanish. It's got to be an Indian language. Well, that's who else is down there, right? Well, who's the biggest Indians down there? The Navajo, the biggest group around. And I think by process of elimination, they figured out it must be Navajo, but they could not get it broken. They could not get it broken, and they never captured any code talkers or anything. So it worked right up to the end, But that's as close as they came to breaking it.
Okay, fascinating. Yeah, I'm glad you went into that history, because, of course, I didn't want to ignore our friends from the Marine Corps or from the Pacific Theater. So I certainly wanted to make sure we talked about the Navajo code talkers as well. As I said earlier, I think to the layperson, if they've heard the term code talker at all, it's probably in reference to the Navajo that were in the Pacific Theater with the Marines. Mm-hmm. I recall there was a film, I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago with Nicolas Cage about a code talking unit. I don't remember the name of the film, but
Wind Talkers.
Wind Talkers, that's it. Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. I did see it, but it's just been a long time. So I think that maybe raised even more awareness of this history. So we won't ask you to comment on whether or not Hollywood got everything right there.
Oh, I can if you want.
Sure, why not? Go ahead.
Well, so they had several Navajo code talkers as technical advisors for the film and everything.
That's good.
And even before they started shooting, they realized there was a problem. Both the film writers knew it, the Marine Corps knew it, everybody knew it. And that is the gist of the movie story is 180 degrees opposite of what actually happened. And what happened was these Navajos were getting trained, and then they were getting broken up in small units, like 6 or 8 of them to a regiment, right? That's pretty small, Mm-hmm. So they would be inserted into these units as new guys. Well, a lot of the Americans looked at them and they thought, these guys look like they're Japanese. And Bill Toledo had that experience when he first got in his reassigned to a company. Nobody would talk to him. Nobody would have anything to do with him. And he finally kind of confronted them and said, what's wrong with you guys? And they're like, well, you're Japanese. We don't want to hang out with you. And he's like, I'm not Japanese. I'm a Native American. I'm an Indian, And after that, it was a moot point. It was fine. He was welcome, just like one of the guys and everything. But what was happening was not when they were actually like in their company, because people would know, yes, he's with us. But when they were doing moves or code talkers were sent on messages or they're out of their basic normal position, they would be mistaken as Japanese and captured by American troops. Again, not your immediate group in your company right around you, your squads, your platoons and things, but people in other units or reserve units. And of course, they were under orders. They could not tell people what they were doing. All they could say is, I'm a radio man. They couldn't talk about the code or anything. And they were only supposed to talk to officers above a certain level, And so it would take time to vouch these guys, to get them verified or vetted, as we say today, and then released back to their units. Well, that defeated the whole purpose of why they were created, was to be on the radios, because they could, as quick as I'm talking to you, you could turn around and translate that into the language, and the message was a go. Whereas if I had to use the shackle cipher, it might be an hour and a half or 3-4 hours to encrypt a message, send it, get it decoded, and actually implement it. And that was the whole beauty of the code talkers, was the speed and the efficiency. And so in the movie, if they presented a movie as Marines who can't recognize other Marines and capture them, that would have made the Marine Corps look inept, which they certainly were not, kind of thing.
Sure, of course.
But you're not going to sell a movie on that plot line. So they create the plot line about, well, if we think they're going to be compromised or captured, then you're ordered to kill them to save the code. And there's some bodyguards that were interviewed, some of the code talkers. It is a common rumor, and it still circulates among the Navajo, but we cannot find any kind of official record or anything that says that was a reality. Now, the reason they were assigned bodyguards is because they were being mistaken. So Bill Toledo, again, one of the guys I interviewed, he ran a message one day, got mistaken as for a Japanese on the way back to his unit, got captured. As soon as he got vetted and cleared, there was another officer that was real close to him in that unit. The captain pulled him aside and said, "You are with him till the end of this. By his side, you foxhole with him, sleep with him, shower, eat, everything. He does not leave your presence," and everything. And so sometimes the code talkers were told who their bodyguard was, and they knew they had a bodyguard. In other cases, someone was just assigned to shadow them all the time. And so there are some that didn't really realize they had a bodyguard until later after the war and everything. But it wasn't so much to protect them. It was to their presence vouched for them. If I'm on a radio and there's a white guy here, nobody's going to say a word, which, you hate to think like that, but that's the reality of it. You're not going to be confused if you're with a white Marine.
Sure.
It's that simple. And this is another area I've got a manuscript on, I'm working on, but not just with the Navajo code talkers, but there was a lot of ethnic misidentification in World War II. Because most of these white American guys had not grown up around all these minorities. And so some of them literally could not tell a Hispanic from a Native American from an Asian. And we have dozens and dozens of cases of people being misidentified, code talkers and non-code talkers, And then we even have some of the Navajos admitting that I can't tell some of the Asians from the other Asians. They're too similar, And so it was a very confusing time to have all these cultures shoved together in these small areas in a life or death situation.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because as you were talking, I was thinking to myself that a follow-up question I would ask, and you kind of addressed it here, is did any of the code talkers, either that you had the opportunity to speak to throughout the course of your research, that I know has been going on for a very long time, or through interviews you've listened to or read, did any of them address any issues of being treated unfairly, or being having people say terrible things to them or anything like that because they were Native? You've kind of talked about the fact that some of them were actually mistaken for Japanese. Mm-hmm. I wonder if that clearly wouldn't have been the case in the European theater, but there certainly was still the case, or the opportunity rather, for Native American soldiers, whether they be code talkers or otherwise, to sort of face some bias.
There were stereotypes, of course, still, and everything. And there were comments sometimes made about, being on the reservation or drinking or things of that nature, or every Native was addressed as chief. That's the nickname. It become chief. And most people I interviewed said, I didn't really care about that. Some groups didn't have formal chiefs, I have met a couple of people that did say, I didn't like the term. It was, but it wasn't really meant derogatory. It's really meant everybody in World War II had a nickname, mm-hmm. And my grandpa told me all the guys half the time they didn't know their real name. They knew them by their nickname, and but they were all called chief and everything. There is what Tom Holm developed. He's a Native American veteran and a retired professor, developed the concept of the Indian Scout Syndrome. And that is, it's a series of really what are positive stereotypes about Indians and their martial abilities. So the idea that, Indians can move through the woods quieter than non-Indians, travel farther, faster, see farther in the dark, all these kind of natural, and the assumption that it's in biologically inherent, that it's just in your blood, kind of thing. And of course, you'll have people of all groups tell you, it's complete fallacy. There are some natives that grew up in the city and didn't have those. And then there's others that grew up in the country, which were very adept. And the same way with whites. There's some whites who were trappers and hunters and very good at military things, and others that were quite clumsy, depending on their background. So there are those kind of stereotypes. I didn't find a lot. And of course, we're prone to call everything racist today. That's the general reaction today. But I only found one case in all the Navajo Code Talker interviews where somebody said, I really felt this was racist. The rest of them said, to me, it seemed like most of it was either just ignorance or it was curiosity. People might ask you a dumb question, but it wasn't out of malice, kind of thing. And the gentlemen that were, and the reason why I say I don't find a tremendous amount of overt racism. Now, there was still racism at home against the natives, and that continued after the war. Even some of the code talkers, when they came back, received dismal treatment from the public and everything. But they said, we didn't have that in the Marine Corps, and we didn't have that in the Army. There wasn't a lot of room for that. Now, you may have some guys that didn't like you or say something once in a while, but there really wasn't the ability for that to be carried very far. It was counterproductive to the unit, And so a couple of the guys, I remember they talked about where they were mistaken. Mm-hmm. And then after that, as soon as it was cleared up, the other soldiers said, sorry, Chief, we thought you were one of them, And then they're like, let me carry your radio for you. Let me carry your, your whatever. And some of them became friends with the guys that mistook them. But there was no malice any further after that. As soon as they were verified as Native American, it was a moot point. You're one of us, So, it wasn't a perfect world, but you also had banter between different European minorities too. That was just the time, that was the common time of the era. But most of them said they felt that they were treated pretty fairly. The only thing is that they were held back in terms of promotions. They were not promoted very much at all. But the reason being is, had they been promoted, they would have been taken out of the role of a code talker. And so if some of them, there's a couple sergeants, some corporals, but most of them stayed privates and things, because if you got promoted very heavily, that would have took you away from that situation to do what you were trained to do. And that was more valuable than them just filling a rank at a certain level,
Okay. That's a really interesting point. Yeah.
There's a logic. Yeah. There's a logic behind, I'm not saying it was fair. It wasn't. Sure. But there's a logic of why they were not promoted heavily. They were there to do something so specific that no one else could.
Yeah. I mean, literally no one else could do it. So It was imperative to keep them where they were to continue to perform that incredibly important task. Yeah.
Yeah. It wasn't just like calling back to the supply depot and getting 10 more riflemen, in a different situation.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I know that in doing some of the reading of some of your work to sort of study up for this conversation, I read a piece that you wrote about a long overdue recognition of Native people that served as code talkers on Capitol Hill several years ago. So I thought maybe we could close with just you maybe describing what that event was like and how you came to be part of that, and what did that mean to the people who were recognized that day.
Yeah. Well, it's a two-part thing. I got a phone call. I did the book on the Comanche Code Talkers in 2002. And somewhere in the spring of 2004, might have been my second semester here at Missouri State, I got a phone call from Senator Tom Daschle's office. And at first, I honestly didn't think it was really Senator Tom Daschle's office, because I know people who make those kind of phone calls. I have friends, But they assured me that it was. And so they asked me to come up and testify on a Senate committee hearing. And so I went up. It was the day that the National Museum of the American Indian opened. So I believe it was September 23rd, I think, of 2004. And we had basically each of us had 15 minutes to present in front of this congressional panel. So Ben Nighthorse Campbell was the chair. So I was there. To my left was Greg Pyle, the president or the chief of the Choctaw Nation. Melvin Kirchie Jr., the vice chairman of the Comanche Nation, was beside me. There were some Ho-Chunk, there were some Lakota, there were some military officers, but we had, I was one of the formal presenters. So they asked me to come up and present any and all about all Native American code talkers that I knew of. And this was aimed at the non-Navajo, because the Navajo had been awarded in 2000 and 2001 with the Congressional Medal. Not the Medal of Honor, the Congressional Gold Medal and Silver Medal. And they wanted to do the same thing. They wanted to hear about the same possibility for the other groups. And so part of my research was to show what a vast number of them there were. Also, they came from World War I originally. So many of these groups were even the World War II groups were recruited before the Navajos. But the Navajo, like we said, it gets more attention, and rightly so. There's possibly as many as 420 Navajo that were trained as code talkers. The biggest group beyond that is 17. So naturally, they have a much larger pool. Approximately 285 of the Navajo actually were used in combat and everything. After their code was declassified in 68 and everything, they formed a Navajo Code Talker Association. So they become very visible, Now, like I say, the largest code talking group beyond the Navajo is only 17 people. So that's really not enough to have a big organization after the war and things. So they are better known. So we all testified that day. And then the phone just never stopped ringing. Different tribes called me. Different kinds of levels of congressional and state representatives and things called me. So legislation was started later that fall, and it took 4 times to go through it. The Choctaws went up and lobbied. The Comanches went up and lobbied several times. There were, of course, letters, and we continued to submit documentation and things on different groups and questions and things. And then finally in 2008, the act was passed. And then they started designing the medals for the other tribes, the non-Navajo groups. And at first they were going to design one medal style for all of them. And of course the tribe said, no, you're not. We're going to have our own medal, our style, our symbols, what's important to us. So each tribe had a medal designed for them. And the tribes participated in the design, working with the U.S. Mint and everything. So it was a back and forth process. So finally in 2013, 25 of the 33 groups were awarded their medals that day. And the other 5 have come since then. They were still in the design process and everything. It was an amazing day. We met in the Emancipation Hall, underneath there, in Emancipation Hall and everything at the Capitol. It was a huge, standing room only kind of crowd and everything. Again, you've got people there from well over 30 some tribes and everything. They had each one representative of each tribe come up and actually receive the medal. There were speeches by several congressional representatives and senators and things of that nature. After that was the gold medal presentation. After that, we moved to the National Museum of the American Indian down the hill, and they had the silver medal ceremonies there in different rooms broken up. And then I had the chance afterwards, I was with some Lakotas up there, and South Dakota decided to have their own ceremony in the Dirksen Senate building. So we went to a third one that day just for the North and South Dakota tribes, and everything. There were several wives of the code talkers present. There were some wives there, lots of, children, nephews and nieces and things. At the gold ceremony, Edmund Harjo was the one World War II living code talker who was still physically able to make the trip. And he was in a wheelchair. And when he saluted the flag and they presented him with the medal, it was a magical moment. I mean, everyone was just applauding, in tears, just moving, because he was actually able to be there and receive it in person. And it's great that he did. I think maybe 5 months later he passed. He was very elderly, but he was the one that got to experience it and everything. Some of the tribes then went home and had their own celebrations. Most of them did in their own tribal gymnasiums or complexes or centers and things, and had a formal dinner and sometimes a dance and things. So this went on really for several months in a sense, even after the gold medals and everything. But it was it's nothing like I never imagined I would get to participate in anything like this, and so it has a different road, but a very special thing for me. And of course, thinking about the ones that I got to work with from the different tribes and things, and the interviews and things like that. So it has a special meaning for me, but it's so important to the tribes because most of these tribes will have that gold medal. Like the Comanches have it in their tribal museum, the Choctaws have it in theirs, etc. And it's a huge source of pride, of kind of regained history, because it's something that wasn't talked about, very little known about it until really the last 20 so years. And I think that will just go on indefinitely, is now that they have been, because that's the highest award Congress can give anyone, is right, the Congressional Gold Medal. And so I think that's a very important legacy that harkens back not just to the Native military service, but the irony of the boarding schools again, the willingness to protect their lands and people as well as the United States, and to have in this case, a really unique form of doing it. So like some of them said, my language was my weapon, and
that's a great line. That's a great quote. That really brings it all home, I think.
Yeah. It's like one of the guys told me in an interview, he said, not making light of any man that served, but if you can pass basic and pass the physical, everybody knows how to carry a carbine and fire it and everything, But this language is one of the Comanches that told me this language, only 17 of us were in that unit. We're the only ones that had that tool, that weapon at that time. And so rightly so, they took great pride in that, but very humble men. I will add that I never knew any of the code talkers themselves to seek the recognition. It was always their tribes or relatives or scholars or, governmental representatives. It was other people that sought the recognition for them. They just went home and got on with their lives and did productive things, And so I think that speaks. We are in such a attention-driven society today, but this generation and this class of men were very humble about it, really, very, very humble.
Well, and that's in line with what you hear about a lot of veterans of any conflict that, come home and get on with their lives and don't always really want to talk about it or seek attention. So, I mean, I think It sounds like, they were certainly of that same view. And then just as a follow-up, last question, I guess, are any code talkers still living today, or have they all passed away now?
The best I know, there a while back there were 3 Navajos still alive that were recognized. One of them that I knew has since passed. John Kinsel passed away not too long ago. The other 2 from what I know, are, very aged, very far up,
Sure.
and not in good shape and everything. That's a hard question to answer, because there may be cases of somebody who was but was never identified, and we just don't know.
Sure.
And then also with the Navajo, there were so many of them, but there's some of them that after the war they never got involved with the association or anything with the code talkers. So again, it's hard to know what all became of some of them. But as far as I know, there's only those two gentlemen left. And
Okay.
that will be it. And we do have a fair amount of interviews and film footage with them, and documentation for some groups and very little for others.
Sure. Well, I think that's what they're experiencing with having very few of their veterans left is also going on in the larger society. Of course, we do a lot of events here with about World War II and about Eisenhower's role. But we understand too that unfortunately World War II veterans are few and far between anymore.
Yes.
But it sounds like that's the case for the code talkers as well. So, well, I want to thank you, Bill, for coming on today. This has been a really enlightening and wonderful conversation. I hope that this proves to be helpful to anyone who wants to research this topic. And if anybody is researching this topic, I certainly hope that they'll be picking up your many works on this subject, because everything that I saw was really excellent and very informative. So thanks for your work. And I hope that there's more great stuff to come from you on this topic.
I'm working on the World War II volume. So
excellent. Well, thanks. I want special thanks to you, Dr. Bill Meadows of Missouri State University, for being with us today. Again, a fascinating topic, and look forward to more of your research coming out. And for the rest of you, I'll say thanks again for tuning in to the Club Eisenhower podcast. This is a project of the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum in Abilene, Kansas, and we'll see you next time.